is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. A few years ago, I was standing in Peace on Fifth in Dayton, Ohio, a shop run by London Co. that carries slavery-free products and focuses on bean-to-bar chocolate. London and I were both tasting samples of a chocolate bar, I can't remember what it was, and she closed her eyes and said almost breathlessly, "This chocolate has hips." London was the person who introduced me to good chocolate that is not only sourced ethically but is crafted for nuanced flavor rather than just as cheap candy. I was right at the beginning of my chocolate journey, and as I do whenever I'm excited about a new thing, I was reading everything I could about chocolate, learning new terms like pods and nibs. So when London said the chocolate had hips, I wondered, what part of the cacao is that? I asked, and she laughed. "Oh, that's just my black girl magic," she said. "I just mean this chocolate has curves and really sways to the music." In that moment, I became aware of several things simultaneously. First, that chocolate was going to become a major part of my life. Second, that London would be a major part of my chocolate journey. And third, that chocolate people talked about chocolate how I wished beer people talked about beer. The chocolate world is drenched in this kind of language, pulling in unlikely analogies, summoning emotion and memory and imagination, and unapologetically playing on whimsy and romance, but without losing sight, usually, of the need to provide helpful, tangible description to consumers. It seems like chocolate is constantly asking folks to close their eyes and go on a voyage, and chocolate people are constantly saying yes. Why is the chocolate world seemingly more willing than the beer world to use evocative or fanciful language and description? Can craft beer grow in its willingness to move beyond purely concrete description, and does it want to? Can this language go too far and become distracting? Thinking back on that foundational experience in Peace on Fifth, I reached out to London to ask about this difference in chocolate and beer language, and she suggests the freedom of expression in chocolate descriptive language comes from the freedom of expression organic to craft chocolate making itself. We spoke on the phone as she walked around her neighborhood, and while the phone audio isn't perfect, her insights are sharp and clear.
I think because in chocolate you don't have to be right. The process of making beer is centuries old and has stayed very much the same in terms of technique. Chocolate is a little more adventurous, and so for that reason it can be whimsical. I think the other thing is that because chocolate is naturally considered a child's treat at the beginning of their introduction into pleasure, that there is this kind of built-in feralness, this kind of built-in play outdoors, this kind of built-in play in the mud that you can just whatever you want. And so because people can roast something, the same bean, and it tastes so different, which I realize is also very permissible with beer, and pull out these flavors, there is this notion that nothing is wrong. And so in beer, you have different categories of beer. You have stout, and you have ale, and you have chocolate is just chocolate. And so in that sense, everybody's in the same sandbox. There's a lot of expectation that you don't take yourself too seriously. But also I think that craft chocolate in particular is built for the whimsy of those who would have it. It can be very exciting, and it brings back not necessarily of how we ate chocolate, but of what we remember about chocolate. So, for instance, for some people, chocolate is definitely the chocolate pie that their grandmother makes. Um, and it is, or it can be, the one treat that they got to enjoy, or it can be what they snuck, the candy or the treat that they snuck away from everything. But there is this kind of, you can do whatever you want here. Everyone is welcome here. Um, and I think also because it's a treat that involves sugar, that it also seems very childlike. And so you can approach it in a childlike way, which makes it very easy for most people.
London points out the long history of brewing, and she's absolutely right. The technical brewing process for beer has remained relatively unchanged for a couple centuries. While a modern brewery looks very different from how one would have looked in, say, 1800, those changes are largely about precision, consistency, and efficiency rather than any massive change in how to take water, grain, hops, and yeast and end up with beer. When the craft brewing movement got started in the US around 40 years ago, the basic brewing process had long been established, along with a host of beer styles with decades or centuries of tradition that were available for those first fledgling craft brewers to choose from. Those varied traditions not only provided an array of new options to return flavorful beer to America, but also provided gutter guards to keep a nascent industry from straying off course. There's good and bad to that. Most craft brewers got their start as home brewers, and they found a leader and champion in Charlie Papazian. Papazian, who turned 71 earlier this year, founded the American Homebrewers Association in 1979, just after homebrewing became legal. A few years later, the Beer Judge Certification Program was organized, an entity that created and continues to curate rigid descriptions of beer styles and certifies judges for grading beers against those guidelines in homebrewing competitions. For better or worse, faithfulness to traditional style guidelines is favored in these friendly competitions, and it's led to clear expectations for what certain styles should taste like. This has the noble and needed consequence of preserving tradition, but it also means beer descriptive language often adheres to a formulaic and concrete pattern best suited to judging and grading. Papazian, by the way, was a nuclear engineer before transitioning to beer, and most of the pioneers of craft beer had science or engineering backgrounds. That served them well, because while the basics of brewing beer can be explained pretty simply, the actual organic science behind what's happening during its various processes and the technical precision needed to control those processes consistently is highly complex. The result was a young industry in which essentially chemists and engineers were creating culinary art. The product was beautiful, but the resulting language, born of engineering and certified judging, was often somewhat cold and literal. I wanted to get the perspective of a beer professional on this, so I reached out to Randy Mosier, a leading voice on sensory appreciation in beer. He's involved with 2 breweries in Chicago, Forbidden Root and Five Rabbit Cerveceria, and is the author of several books on beer, including Tasting Beer, one of the go-to texts if you want to learn the basics of beer and how best to enjoy it. Did he notice the difference between the kind of language used to describe beer and that used with other artisan foods and drinks?
Well, I think that's generally accurate, and I think that there's room for improvement on both sides. I would say, on the beer side, I think it's really because so many people who are involved in judging are also brewing, right? So BJCP, that's basically brewers judging brewers in GABF and World Beer Cup and things like that. Those are also primarily brewers judging brewers, although they do allow some other experts in to the mix. And I think, that focus on beer styles and sort of ticking off the list of what kind of characteristics make a style, I think it does, that style-based judging does have a bit of a deficit philosophically in that it minimizes wonderfulness, as I call it. That like, I mean, that's basically when you get to that last round and you've got a table full of beers that are all equally in style or not out of style. And then you have to go on like, well, is it really delicious? And if so, how? How does this beer, what will be memorable about this beer for you? It's always, for me, the highest standard is, will I be telling people about this beer? Will I remember this beer in a month or a year? Does this make some impression on me? And that's, coming from a point of view of somebody who's spent a career in art, and like, that's the purpose of art, which brewing is definitely a one form of. And that ability to make a psychological impression and create an image or tell a story, paint a picture. We try and do those at the two breweries that I'm involved in. And I think that's, so I think a little more romance in beer descriptions wouldn't be a bad thing.
Beer descriptions on labels, reviews, or elsewhere tend to focus on a short and tangible list of tasting notes with very little romance added in. This contrasts with craft chocolate, where reviewers and even the makers themselves often focus on what you might be feeling as you taste their bars, rather than on exactly what you should be tasting. The inference is that while beer is intoxicating, chocolate is the drug that can alter your mind and tap into your deeper emotions. Map Chocolate out of Oregon is run by a spirited and highly creative woman named Mackenzie Rivers. Mackenzie is also a writer, and inside the package of each bar, she includes a slip of paper with an imaginative piece of writing that riffs on the flavors of the bar. These might be poems or short stories from her own memory, thoughts on a favorite song, just something that connects to what this bar meant to her and what she hopes it might mean to you. Often enough, there's no mention of specific tasting notes. On each of these slips, she includes the same introductory text. It reads, "Chocolate is a leaping-off place. When crafted well, a bite can recall memories from distant moments, summon notes of a song, conjure a favorite place, or that day when the sun glinted off the water just so. Each bite reveals a winding history and far-flung geography of cultivation, the people and places who share the journey, birds landing amongst leaves, rain falling, flowers blooming, hands tending. Cacao has a beautiful story to tell, and happily for us, the language it speaks is chocolate." I first heard those words read aloud by my friend Megan Giller, professional chocolate taster and author of the book Bean to Bar Chocolate, America's Craft Chocolate Revolution. I asked Megan why she thinks this difference exists between descriptions of beer and chocolate, even when both are being crafted for flavor. Why do you think chocolate is so primed to be able to pull in all of that evocative language when some other connoisseur food or drinks maybe are a little more resistant to it?
I really think it's because chocolate's so nostalgic. We have these very early memories of chocolate, and even if it's not a super fancy single origin dark chocolate bar, we have very early memories of, grandma making chocolate pudding, or on special occasions eating chocolate chip cookies or chocolate cake or something like that. And it's actually something that I ask at the beginning of my chocolate tastings, if people will share their memories of their first memories or early memories of chocolate. And I'm always really amazed that people from all sorts of different cultures from all over the world always have these very early memories. And I think when you try a certain bar, it sometimes can evoke those memories, even though it has a different taste. It's not that same pudding or candy bar or whatever it is. It still taps into that, very visceral memory, right? And some part of it is still like brings it up. The way kind of, if you smell something that you haven't smelled in a long time, it can be very jarring, kind of in a good way though, where you're like, oh wow, I suddenly remember all this stuff that I wouldn't have remembered otherwise.
Jess Reiser is the co-founder of Burial Beer in Asheville, North Carolina, a brewery that often uses more fanciful descriptive text to explain their beers rather than just concrete flavor description. They're one of countless modern breweries that don't restrict themselves to just brewing faithful representations of traditional styles, but use an array of additional flavor ingredients to create really fascinating explorations of flavor, including sometimes chocolate from French Broad Chocolate, a bean-to-bar maker in Asheville. I spoke with Jess about the difference between beer and chocolate language, why she thinks it exists, and how the beer competitions that gave rise to that language often don't leave room for more esoteric expressions of flavor in brewing.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
Yeah, I think that there is a difference. I've definitely, again, from reading French Broad specifically, they're little like tasting notes. I do kind of pick out on certain words that, like enrobed is a word that they use that just perhaps wouldn't as easily apply to beer. But I love that word and want to use it. I think about wine as well in this. So there's a lot of descriptors in wine that are not used in beer and vice versa. And so, it's interesting to think about like how those types of vernaculars, I guess, develop through professional tasters, right? And I think that is also perhaps a difference there, at least, in speaking with JL, craft chocolate is not, maybe from a chronological standpoint or in the development of that industry, not where beer is, and certainly then not where wine is, historically. And so there's an opportunity for the current chocolatiers to really, I think, harness the beginnings of this industry and create a lot of those notes as well, where, wine certainly being around for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years, there's a lot more structure to that, and a lot more like, these are the words that are used to describe these types of wines. And then beer kind of falls somewhere in the middle, where there are like the Cicerone and the, BJCP and, people who have formulated, okay, if it's an IPA, this is kind of what we, anyway, from, an institution expect it to taste like. And certainly craft brewers kind of, depending on the brewery, will kind of take that and run with it or run away from it. That's something where we, as a brewery, don't submit beers to those types of competitions because we will never check the boxes of these style parameters. And so that kind of gives us, yes, like, well, I want to hit certain, descriptors so that people recognize it as an IPA or as a porter. We are also kind of adding in and experimenting a lot, whether it's with adjuncts or different, craft maltsters, to really come up with some of our own flavor profiles, which can lead certainly, to some of our own, or some of my husband's own words that he can apply in those descriptions.
I next spoke with Jess's friend and regular collaborator, J.L. Radigan, co-founder of French Broad Chocolate, about this topic, and she discussed the ways in which chocolate is inherently emotional. She made the same point London and Megan made about how our nostalgia for childhood plays into that, and points to how a child's first curious experiences of delight with flavor can show us how to approach flavor and, by extension, the vocabulary for describing it in an open-minded way. Would you care to share why you think chocolate lovers are maybe a little bit more willing to delve into some of that than beer drinkers are?
And see, it's interesting how even your question is a bit loaded with emotion versus non-emotion. You've got beer drinkers and chocolate lovers.
Wasn't intentional, but you're right.
I know. I think it is just an association that we have with chocolate, that it's emotional. We use chocolate as a tool to manage our emotions, whether it's, like it's used romantically, it's used to show romantic love. It's used to show care and friendship. It's used to comfort people when they're feeling sad. And there are, scientific and chemical reasons for that. And, I am definitely not a scientist and, can speak generally about it, but not specifically. But, it has been discovered that there are hormones in chocolate that mimic the hormones of the feeling of falling in love. And so it's, so there's, science in the actual impact or effect on our body chemistry. And then also that emotional association that is formed where we associate chocolate with those feelings and emotions of love and friendship and care and comfort.
And you've also mentioned the idea that chocolate is something that we have pretty early in life. Most of us don't have our first beer at 3 or 4, but we probably had our first chocolate then.
Definitely. Our sense memory is really powerful and impacts how we think about and how we experience food and beverage throughout our lives. At least it has for me. So yeah, I have such a distinct memory of my first son's first birthday. Was the first time he ate chocolate. And I have a picture of him that just makes me so happy to look at, because the picture is him. He's in, like, we were living in Costa Rica at the time. We made him a chocolate birthday cake, and he's wearing like no shirt. He's got a bandana tied around his neck like a cape and tie-dye pants, just straight hippie kid. And his face is covered in chocolate. And the look on his face in the photo is not like happy, like, oh, chocolate, this is so good. It was almost more like, why haven't you shared this with me before? Like, what else are you hiding from me? So it was a really funny experience, but really, just powerful to try new things is so exciting. To eat is so exciting. Even before babies eat food, they mimic you eating food. They watch you. They open their mouths when you're opening your mouth. They practice with their hands, before it's even developmentally, appropriate for them to eat food. It's part of the process of learning. And just watching, the joy and the disgust and, all of the emotions that you witness watching someone start to eat is really amazing. I don't know if you have kids, but what a cool process that is. Like, my first son used to love eating lemons, and he would, make the face. I think a lot of kids do that. They make the face and they, scrunch up their eyes, but it's so pleasurable because it's exciting.
By returning to that childlike sense of wonder and discovery, even when we're tasting an adult beverage, perhaps we could explore a more holistic vocabulary for describing beer flavors. It's important, though, that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and lose the concrete flavor descriptions that help consumers make sense of the dizzying variety of beer styles on shelves today. Beer does a good job, for the most part, of helping consumers know some of what to expect when they open a bottle or can of beer. The problem is just that beer stops with those descriptions and generally fails to engage or appeal to the consumer's imagination or their emotional self. It's possible to go too far into that realm, however. Wine often falls into this, providing fanciful label copy or review notes that can fail at their fundamental purpose, to help consumers make decisions. Randy Mosier pointed out this problem with wine descriptions and the importance of avoiding this pitfall in growing the descriptive language for beer.
There are actually people in the wine world writing papers like on bullshit in wine, right? So there's this quality called bullshit, and it's a sort of a technical term meaning that the descriptions that are written by a lot of reviewers bear no resemblance whatsoever to the physical, actual chemical content of the wine.
Sure.
That they're written about, oh, the beautiful meadows on this estate reminds me of a fresh spring day, or what, I mean, it's very imagey, but it's completely like disconnected from the physical reality of the liquid. If you think about an experience in a restaurant, whether it's a fine restaurant with 200 wines on their list or just a casual neighborhood place with a couple of dozen, there's never any information. You get where you get the name of it and probably the country of origin and maybe a AVA or a region, some type of DOC or region or something. But if you ask your server, what's this wine like? They'll go, oh, it's really good. Well, that's not really what I want to know. Like, tell me what the experience is. Here's 3 lighter reds on your menu. What's the difference between them? Oh, I like this one. No, that's not my question. And I'm sort of a pain in the ass wine customer because I want like, is it acidic? Is it oaky? Is it buttery? Is it like what? Tell me something that I can use, because I'm used to understanding things not in just that completely bogus, flowery kind of way. I don't see the value in that. Apparently it must work really well or people wouldn't use it. But it seems like as a consumer who does like wine, it seems like completely useless. And so you're left to make the decision based on what the price is. That's a fraught decision.
Do you think we can find a happy medium between accurate descriptive language and evocative language?
Oh, yeah, I think so, very much. And certainly people like Lauren at New Belgium is really great at that. And, she actually, there's a famous perfume book that she goes to, written by a guy named Luca Turin, who's a real interesting character, but they're very poetic. They're very descriptive, yet they're very poetic. And she's like, whenever I can't think of something, I'll just get this book up and see like how he uses language and try and find ways to do that. So there's people out there consciously working on it, but I think everybody in the business, especially that interface between that sort of marketing interface, that informational thing where you're trying to tell people about your beers, a little bit of romance, a little bit of selling the story and helping people wrap their heads around the overall, like, what's the emotional experience like, right? Because ultimately that's why people buy beer outside of just the alcohol. They want to feel, they want it to make them feel something, feel happy or feel amazed or feel comforted or whatever it happens to be. So it's complicated, but I think that's the goal.
If the goal is for a maker to give consumers both an accurate expectation of what a food or drink will taste like, as well as some deeper or more holistic reason to care about those flavors, what does that actually look like in practice? It really doesn't require more than a little imagination. The examples I'll give now will be specific to breweries, but the principles apply to chocolate, wine, or any other artisan product. It can help to think of flavor description on several different tiers. The first tier involves technical analysis of flavors as related to the processes and ingredients used in production. This is an industry-focused description, one you might find during competition judging, and it might include pointing out specific chemical flavor compounds, the ingredients they're derived from, and or how processes or ingredients might be altered to eliminate, adjust, or amplify particular characteristics. A lot of this is unlikely to be useful or appealing to consumers, but a mention of some ingredients or a traditional or experimental process might be informative or intriguing. The second tier is where craft beer typically excels, concrete flavor descriptors. This is a list of specific flavor notes one might find in the finished beer. They might be directly from an actual flavor addition, so maybe peaches were used and you'll taste peach in the beer, or they might be evoked by other ingredients, such as notes of grapefruit and pine from Cascade or other related hop varieties, or toasted bread crust from Munich malt. This might also include basic tastes you might find in the beer: sweet, sour, bitter, even salty, and in rare cases, savory. This tier lets the consumer know what the beer actually tastes and smells like. The third tier will use some fanciful, image-rich language to evoke emotions or engage imagination, making the beer sound more appealing. This might mean saying that the pale ale that has those Cascade hops is like having a citrusy brunch in the middle of a pine forest in the lazy late morning sunlight. There are endless options here for creating images or feelings in the consumer, and this doesn't have to be far-fetched or masturbatory in the way the worst examples of wine language can be. Just go beyond the basics. Appeal to the mind and heart as much as the senses. The final tier is descriptive copy that has no direct connection to the flavors contained in the beer, but is intended to put the taster in a particular mood or mindset. Think of these descriptions as artist statements of a sort. They can range from philosophical voyages through the cosmos to poetic reflections on the natural landscape around the brewery. These can get esoteric pretty quickly, but used sparingly can add a spark of mystery or excitement or gracefulness to a description. Helpful but evocative beer descriptions might include a lot of tiers 2 and 3, with elements of the others mixed in as appropriate. Some breweries go all in, though. I want to read an example from Jess's brewery, Burial Beer, because they somehow managed to employ all of these tiers in almost every beer description. I could have picked any of their beers as an example, but here's the description for Tombs of Technicolor, a 12% ABV golden sour ale. It starts out pretty wild, but ends up telling you everything you need to know. These things appear within the confines of the unseen, from the cracks in our painted universe, from the belly of our bellowing consciousness, into the swing of our imploding existence. A blend of highly beloved barley wine, each having 10 to 18 months of bourbon barrel aging lifetime, aged upon a load of fresh banana, whole Madagascar vanilla bean, Spicewallace cinnamon, and a pleasing dose of sea salt, a violent pall of creme brulee, Tabeside bananas Foster, and densely spiced banana bread. So they give you ingredients and processes, specific flavor notes, fanciful flavor description, and mood-setting poetic statements all in one succinct paragraph. Not every beer description needs all of those elements, but more than just a basic checklist of flavors would certainly be nice. I don't mean to imply breweries are uniformly bad at this. There are countless craft breweries employing beautiful language in describing their beers, but there is room for improvement for many, and a more consistent expectation for beer description would help set the stage for consumers to talk about beer with more freedom of expression as well. As London pointed out when discussing why chocolate doesn't seem to be struggling with this as much as beer, there is so often a need to be right when talking about craft beer. I sometimes get the feeling beer people coldly list off tasting notes because we don't want other tasters to think we missed something. I can feel that for myself even when I'm tasting beer with other people I like and trust. Some of that might be because of the need of beer to prove itself, the unfair and inaccurate perceived inferiority of beer compared to wine or other artisan products that still persists in the U.S. for many people. I wonder sometimes too, though, if it's a different kind of ego issue. For most of its history, craft beer has been heavily male-dominated, and while pioneering women have always been involved in craft beer, and the industry as a whole is thankfully changing to allow for more women in all areas of the beer world, there is still a stereotypically masculine perception to beer for many, and I think that perception can give permission for a stereotypically male reticence toward emotional expression. I talked about this briefly with Megan, and she pointed out that while most chocolate makers are male, the stereotypically feminine perception of chocolate certainly might account for some of this difference.
Well, I think that's such an interesting insight because you're right, but all the craft chocolate makers are men also, you know? And so I don't know if it's just a different type of man.
Maybe. I think there's an external perception, though, that chocolate itself, and it makes no sense, but in some way, chocolate is feminine.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
That's the other thing I was going to say that I'm most interested in too, is really thinking about the history of chocolate and sugar and how it really has been cast as feminine. And this transition that has happened from like, you know, especially with sugar, well, even chocolate, when you think about Montezuma and stuff, like it was a position of power to be able to have sugar or chocolate or some of these other raw goods a long time ago. And then at some point just in our modern history, they've become feminized. And I think that transition is really interesting and would like to write a book about it at some point. I'm still figuring out what that book would look like. But I like your idea too. I think I'm going to have to think about that, about like the dude bros who don't want to talk about, you know, their beer, their feelings versus the like flowery language on chocolate packages.
That's a topic we'll explore more another time because it's a loosely formed idea for right now. I certainly look forward to Megan's future work on this history of chocolate along gendered lines, and I'm interested in the ways gendered perceptions of different food and drink segments might influence their internal culture. If you have constructive thoughts on this, I'd be happy to hear from you. Craft beer is good at accurate flavor description, but it can get better at consistently using evocative, imaginative language by looking to bean to bar chocolate. And chocolate can follow craft beer's example of providing simple, accurate tasting notes. The combination of accurate flavor description and fanciful language that appeals to the consumer's imagination or memory or emotion will both improve consumer satisfaction and also elevate the tasting experience. Within that, there's freedom to just have fun, to be whimsical, to play with language, to not need to be right every time. When you're tasting beer or chocolate with friends or colleagues or just taking notes for yourself, try to go beyond a simple list of flavors. Include those, but pay attention to the images that come to mind and to what you're feeling as you taste. Our senses are made of magic, or at least really, really cool science, which is basically the same thing, and interact with so many other aspects of who we are. You can learn more about today's guests in the show notes. The music for this episode was performed by my friend Anna P.S. You can find her info in the show notes or at annapsmusic.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.